Zoe Carter was a woman driven by her past, a relentless pursuit of justice fueled by the wounds of a tragedy that refused to heal. Years ago, her younger sister, Emily, vanished without a trace from a quiet suburban town not unlike the one Zoe was driving into now. Back then, Zoe had been a promising federal agent, her career on the rise. But Emily's disappearance had shattered her focus, and the fruitless search that followed drove her to resign from her position. Over the years, Zoe reinvented herself as a private investigator and forensic analyst, working freelance on cases that often blurred the line between criminal investigation and uncovering systemic corruption. Each case was a piece of armor, a layer of expertise that she hoped one day might lead her to answers about Emily. Today, Zoe found herself entering a small, picturesque town that appeared idyllic on the surface. Tree-lined streets, a bustling town square, and residents who greeted one another with smiles gave it the appearance of a community untouched by the darkness she had spent her life chasing. But Zoe had learned to distrust appearances. The case that brought her here was unlike most of her usual assignments. This time she had been contacted anonymously, the message sent through an encrypted channel used by whistleblowers and activists. The message had been brief: people are disappearing. The police are involved. This town has secrets. Come if you care about justice. Attached were files containing reports of missing persons, most of whom were from vulnerable communities, low-income workers, immigrants, and runaways, people who were unlikely to be searched for by authorities. Each case was marked unsolved or inactive. The files also included accusations of police misconduct and evidence tampering, though nothing concrete enough to hold up in court. It was the kind of case Zoe couldn't ignore. As she drove through the town's main street, her sharp eyes scanned her surroundings, noting the details that others might overlook. The local diner was crowded with patrons, while across the street, a patrol car idled near a corner store. Two officers stood outside, chatting casually. Their relaxed demeanor seemed at odds with the reports Zoe had read about the town's high crime rates and unusually efficient police force. It was rare for any department to boast a near-perfect record of arrests and convictions, especially in a town this small. To Zoe, it felt too perfect, as if the numbers had been manipulated or worse, fabricated. Her destination was the modest bed and breakfast where she would be staying under the guise of a sociologist conducting research on small-town crime trends. It was a convenient cover, one that allowed her access to local archives and the ability to ask questions without raising suspicion. As she checked in, the friendly owner, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, handed her a room key and chatted about the town's history. Zoe listened politely, filing away details that might later prove useful. Margaret mentioned that the town had seen a surge in economic growth in recent years, thanks in part to modern policing methods that kept crime under control. The praise sounded rehearsed, as if it had been repeated too many times to too many visitors. After settling into her room, Zoe unpacked her equipment, a high-powered laptop, encrypted communication devices, and a portable forensic kit. She had learned to travel light but never unprepared. Her first step was to visit the town's public records office to gather information on the missing persons cases and cross-reference them with police reports. But as she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. The sender was anonymous as expected, but the message was unsettling. "They're already watching you." Zoe froze for a moment, her instincts kicking in. She checked the room for surveillance devices, finding nothing obvious. It wasn't her first time being watched, but the timing was too precise to ignore. Undeterred, she left the bed and breakfast and headed toward the records office. The town seemed ordinary enough as she walked through its streets, but there was an underlying tension she couldn't quite place. She noticed how people glanced at her, their eyes lingering a little too long before quickly looking away. It wasn't just curiosity about a stranger in their town, it was something more cautious, almost fearful. Zoe reminded herself to stay calm, blending into the rhythm of the town as best she could. The records office was a small, unassuming building near the town hall. Inside, the clerk was polite but wary, her smile strained as Zoe introduced herself and requested access to public records. "We don't usually get researchers here," the clerk said, her tone neutral but her eyes probing. Zoe responded with a rehearsed story about studying crime patterns for an academic paper, producing a fabricated university ID to back her claim. The clerk seemed to accept it and handed over a stack of files. As Zoe sifted through the documents, patterns began to emerge. The missing persons cases were eerily consistent. The victims all disappeared under similar circumstances, last seen walking alone late at night or leaving work at odd hours. The police reports were sparse, with minimal details and no indication of follow-up investigations. It was as if the cases had been deliberately buried. Zoe also noticed that several of the victims had prior run-ins with the law, mostly for minor offenses. It was enough to create a narrative that these were people who brought trouble upon themselves, a convenient excuse for a department looking to avoid scrutiny. One name kept appearing in the reports: Officer Ray Daniels. His signature was on nearly every case file, either as the responding officer or the lead investigator. Daniels was a decorated officer with years of service, known in the town as a model policeman. But the files painted a different picture, one of a man who consistently bent the rules, conducted searches without warrants, and used excessive force. His name was also mentioned in several anonymous complaints filed by residents, accusing him of intimidation and harassment. Zoe's instincts told her Daniels was more than just a corrupt cop. He was the key to whatever was happening in this town. As she left the records office, she noticed the same patrol car from earlier parked outside. Daniels himself was leaning against it, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't approach her, but his message was clear. He knew who she was and what she was doing. Zoe met his gaze briefly before walking away, her mind racing. She needed to move carefully. One wrong step, and she could end up as another name in a forgotten file. Back in her room, Zoe began piecing together what she had learned. The town's perfect crime statistics, the missing persons, and Daniel's involvement were all connected. But she didn't yet have enough to prove it. She needed hard evidence, something that could expose the system Daniels seemed to control. As night fell, she prepared for her next move, knowing that every step she took brought her closer to the truth and closer to danger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Zoe Carter prepared for the next step in her investigation. The day's discoveries had left her unsettled, and the growing realization that something sinister was at play only strengthened her resolve. She sat at the small desk in her room, cross-referencing the files she had copied from the records office with online databases and news articles. It was tedious work, but patterns were beginning to emerge, patterns that pointed directly to Officer Ray Daniels. His name wasn't just tied to missing persons reports. It also appeared in unrelated cases where evidence had mysteriously surfaced or suspects had suddenly confessed under dubious circumstances. Daniels wasn't simply a cog in the machine, he was orchestrating it. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dimly lit room as she studied satellite images of the town. One area caught her attention, an old industrial park on the outskirts, long abandoned according to public records. Yet, she'd noticed it mentioned in passing in some of the reports, often as the last known location of a missing person. It was also flagged in an anonymous tip she had received earlier that day, one she initially dismissed as speculation. Now, however, it felt like a lead worth pursuing. Zoe closed her laptop and double-checked her gear: a flashlight, a multi-tool, a small recording device, and a compact handgun she carried for protection. She tucked them into her jacket and left the bed and breakfast, keeping her movements casual to avoid drawing attention. The town had grown quieter as night fell, with only a few people lingering on the streets. As she walked, she remained hyper-aware of her surroundings, her sharp instincts honed from years of fieldwork. A few blocks away, she spotted a familiar patrol car parked near a convenience store. Daniels was nowhere in sight, but the sight of his vehicle was enough to put her on edge. She kept moving, slipping into the shadows whenever possible. The industrial park loomed ahead, its rusted fences and crumbling buildings a stark contrast to the polished facade of the town. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. Zoe slipped through a gap in the fence, her flashlight off as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of a generator. That sound alone was enough to confirm her suspicions this place wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. She moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as she approached the largest building in the complex. The generator's hum grew louder, and she noticed faint light seeping through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Peering inside, she saw what looked like a makeshift office, its walls covered in maps and documents. There were filing cabinets, a desk cluttered with papers, and what appeared to be surveillance monitors displaying various parts of the town. The sight of the monitors made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a hidden operation, it was a command center. Zoe searched for a way in, eventually finding an unlocked side door. She slipped inside, her steps silent on the concrete floor. The air was damp and carried a faint chemical smell, like cleaning solvents mixed with something more acrid. The office was just ahead, separated from the rest of the building by a glass partition. As she moved closer, she heard faint voices. Pressing herself against the wall, she strained to listen. Two men were talking, their tones low and conspiratorial. "Daniels wants the next shipment ready by morning," one of them said. "He's already pissed about the last delay." "It's not my fault," the other replied, his voice defensive. "We didn't expect that woman to put up such a fight." She almost got away. Zoe's heart pounded as she processed their words. They weren't just detaining people, they were trafficking them. The realization hit her like a blow, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed. This was bigger than she had imagined, and far more dangerous. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay focused. She needed evidence, something tangible she could take with her to expose this operation. She waited for the men to leave, then slipped into the office. Her hands moved quickly but methodically as she scanned the documents on the desk. They were shipping manifests, listing names, dates, and destinations. The names matched those of the missing persons she had been investigating. She photographed everything, her camera's shutter muffled to avoid detection. She moved to the filing cabinets, pulling open drawers and flipping through folders. One file caught her eye. It was labeled with a date that matched the night her sister disappeared. Her hands trembled as she opened it, finding a photograph of Emily, along with a brief description: transported. Status: unknown. The flood of emotions was almost overwhelming, but Zoe pushed it down. There was no time to process the implications. She tucked the file into her jacket and turned her attention to the surveillance monitors. One of them displayed the interior of another building in the complex, where several people were being held in cages. The sight turned her stomach, but it also steeled her resolve. She had to get these people out, But first, she needed to secure the evidence. As she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned off her flashlight and pressed herself into a corner, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. The door creaked open, and the beam of a flashlight swept across the room. Daniel stepped inside, his posture relaxed but his expression sharp. He glanced around, his flashlight landing briefly on the open filing cabinet. "I know you're here," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You're good, but not good enough." Zoe stayed perfectly still, her heart pounding in her ears. Daniels moved further into the room, his flashlight scanning every corner. He stopped near the desk, his gaze landing on the missing file. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room was filled with a tense silence. Then he spoke again, louder this time. "You've made a big mistake," he said. "You think you can come into my town, poke around in my business and walk away. Not gonna happen." Zoe knew she had to act. As Daniels turned toward the filing cabinets, she stepped out of the shadows, her gun aimed steadily at his chest. "Drop the flashlight," she ordered, her voice low but firm. Daniels froze for a moment, then slowly turned to face her. He didn't drop the flashlight. Instead, he smirked, his confidence unshaken. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said. "You think you're the first person to try this? You won't make it out alive." Before she could respond, the door burst open, and two more men entered, guns drawn. Zoe ducked behind the desk as shots rang out, splintering the wood and shattering the glass partition. She returned fire, her training kicking in as she calculated her next move. She couldn't take them all out, not here and not now. She needed to escape. Using the chaos to her advantage, Zoe grabbed the hard drive from one of the surveillance monitors and shoved it into her bag. She fired another round to keep the men at bay, then sprinted toward the side door. The generator's hum grew louder as she ran, the sound almost drowning out the shouts and footsteps behind her. She reached the fence and slipped through the gap, disappearing into the darkness before her pursuers could catch up. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she made her way back to town, every nerve in her body on high alert. She knew she had only bought herself a little time. Daniels wouldn't let this go. He would come after her, and when he did, she needed to be ready. But for now, she had what she needed: evidence that could blow his operation wide open. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to use it. The night seemed endless as Zoe Carter ran through the maze-like streets, her breathing labored but controlled, her mind racing as fast as her feet. The stolen hard drive in her bag felt heavier than it was, a tangible reminder of the risks she had taken. Every shadow in the dimly lit alleys seemed alive, and every distant noise made her grip her handgun tighter. She knew she wasn't safe, not yet. Daniels and his men wouldn't rest until they found her, and she couldn't afford to slow down, not when she was so close to uncovering the full truth. Zoe had planned her route carefully. She didn't head back to the bed and breakfast. That was too obvious. Instead, she moved toward an old auto repair shop she'd scouted earlier that day as a potential fallback point. It was abandoned, its windows shattered and its interior dark, but it provided cover. She slipped inside through a side door, her movements practiced and deliberate. Once inside, she checked her surroundings, sweeping the room with her flashlight before barricading the entrance with a heavy toolbox. For now, she had a moment to breathe. She pulled the hard drive from her bag and connected it to her laptop, which she had managed to keep with her throughout the chaos. The screen illuminated her face, casting sharp shadows as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The encryption on the drive was formidable, but Zoe had spent years developing the skills to crack systems like this. She didn't just want access to the files, she needed to ensure she wasn't leaving a digital trail that could alert Daniels or anyone else to her location. The process was slow, and every second felt like an eternity. As the first folder opened, Zoe's suspicions were confirmed. The drive contained detailed records of the trafficking operation, including names, dates, and locations. It wasn't just about the people who had gone missing from this town, it was part of a larger network spanning multiple states. There were payment logs, coded communications, and even video recordings of the prisoners being transported. Each piece of data was more damning than the last, and Zoe couldn't shake the sickening feeling that she had only scratched the surface of the operation's depravity. Then she found something that made her stomach drop. One of the files was a personnel dossier, and at the top of the list was Ray Daniels. His role wasn't just that of a participant, he was a coordinator, overseeing logistics and ensuring the operation ran smoothly. There were emails between him and other officials, including references to payments that implied the involvement of higher-ups in the town's government. Zoe had suspected corruption, but this was on a level she hadn't anticipated. Daniels wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was part of a conspiracy that reached far beyond this small town. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she debated her next move. She needed to get this information to someone who could act on it, but she also needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. She continued sifting through the files until she came across something that froze her in place. It was a folder labeled Special Assets. Inside, she found photos and profiles of individuals who had been marked as high value by the traffickers. Many of them were young women, and as Zoe scrolled through the list, her breath caught in her throat. There, among the profiles, was her sister Emily. The photo was older, taken years ago, but there was no mistaking her face. The accompanying notes were sparse but chilling: transported, status, active. Zoe's hands trembled as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. Emily was alive, or at least she had been when this file was last updated. But where was she now? The location field in the document was blank, a cruel void that offered no answers. Zoe felt a surge of emotions, relief that Emily might still be out there, anger at those who had taken her, and an overwhelming determination to bring her back. Before she could delve deeper, the sound of footsteps outside shattered her concentration. She quickly closed the laptop and extinguished the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Her pulse quickened as she drew her gun, moving silently toward the door. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Zoe pressed herself against the wall, her ears straining to pick up the conversation. "She's got to be around here somewhere," one voice said, low and tense. "Daniels wants her alive." "Alive but not unharmed," another replied, his tone cold. "He said we could rough her up if she resists." Zoe tightened her grip on the gun, her mind racing as she calculated her options. She couldn't afford to be captured, not when she was so close to unraveling the conspiracy. The auto shop had multiple exits, but she knew the men would have them covered. Her only advantage was the element of surprise, and she intended to use it. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. Zoe waited, her body pressed against the wall, her breathing shallow. One of the men stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He was armed, but his posture suggested he wasn't expecting a fight. Zoe moved quickly, striking him hard in the back of the head with the butt of her gun. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. She grabbed his weapon and slipped back into the shadows as the second man entered, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the room. "Where the hell did you go?" he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Zoe didn't give him a chance to react. She emerged from the darkness, her gun trained on him. "Drop it," she ordered, her voice low and steady. The man froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice wavering. "Kick your weapon toward me," she commanded. He hesitated for a moment, then complied, sending his gun skidding across the floor. Zoe picked it up, keeping her own weapon trained on him. "Who else is out there?" she demanded. "Just us," he stammered. "We were sent to bring you in. That's all." "Where's Daniels?" she pressed. The man hesitated, then answered, "He's at the main site, setting up the next shipment. He said he'll deal with you personally once we bring you in." Zoe's mind raced. She needed to act quickly if she was going to stay ahead of Daniels. She motioned for the man to move toward the corner of the room, then used a piece of rope she found nearby to tie his hands. She didn't have time for elaborate knots, but it would slow him down long enough for her to make her escape. With both men neutralized, Zoe grabbed her laptop and slipped out of the building through a side window. She moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows as she made her way toward the outskirts of town. Her next objective was clear. She needed to find the main site the man had mentioned. If Daniels was there, it was likely the hub of the operation and her best chance of finding more information about Emily. The industrial park loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Zoe approached cautiously, her every sense on high alert. She knew Daniels would have guards stationed throughout the area, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She found a vantage point near one of the smaller buildings, using a pair of binoculars to survey the scene. There were multiple vehicles parked outside, including vans that matched descriptions from the trafficking reports. Men moved in and out of the buildings, their movements purposeful and coordinated. It was clear this wasn't a small operation, it was a well-oiled machine. Zoe's attention was drawn to a central warehouse, its large doors slightly ajar. Inside, she could see crates stacked high, along with tables covered in equipment she couldn't identify from a distance. It was the heart of the operation, and she needed to get inside. She waited for an opening, then moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows as she approached the building. The warehouse was larger than it had seemed from the outside, its interior a maze of crates and machinery. Zoe moved carefully, her gun drawn, her ears attuned to every sound. She spotted a group of prisoners huddled in one corner, their hands bound, their faces pale with fear. Among them was a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Emily. For a moment, Zoe's heart leapt, but as she moved closer, she realized it wasn't her sister. Still, the sight of the prisoners strengthened her resolve. She continued deeper into the warehouse, her goal the makeshift office she had seen from the outside. The office was empty when she entered, but its desk was cluttered with papers and maps. She quickly began photographing everything, her movements precise and efficient. One map caught her attention. It was marked with routes leading out of the town, each one labeled with a destination. Zoe realized these were the trafficking routes, the paths used to transport the victims to other locations. One route led to a city where Emily's trail had gone cold years ago. Before she could process the implications, the sound of footsteps approached the office. Zoe turned, her gun raised, as Daniel stepped into the room. His expression was calm, almost amused, as he looked at her. "You've been busy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But this is where it ends." Zoe didn't reply. She fired a warning shot, forcing Daniels to dive for cover. The room erupted into chaos as more men entered, and Zoe found herself in a firefight, outnumbered and outgunned. She moved with precision, her training keeping her alive as she took down one attacker after another. But she knew she couldn't hold them off forever. As the fight raged on, Zoe spotted a stack of barrels marked with warning labels. An idea formed in her mind, and she fired at the barrels, causing an explosion that sent flames and smoke billowing through the warehouse. In the chaos, she made her escape, the stolen files and photographs tucked safely in her bag. She didn't look back as the warehouse burned, her only focus on the next step in her mission, exposing the operation and finding Emily, no matter the cost. The glow of the fire from the warehouse faded in the distance as Zoe Carter pushed herself further into the night, her muscles aching, her lungs burning, but her mind sharper than ever. The explosion had given her a narrow window to escape, but she knew it wouldn't slow Daniels and his men for long. Her every step was calculated, every corner turned with deliberate care as she navigated through the darkened outskirts of the town. She had mapped her exit strategy long before infiltrating the warehouse, but the chaos of the firefight had forced her off course, and now she was improvising, relying on her instincts and training to guide her. Zoe's objective was clear. The files and photographs she had taken from the warehouse were damning, but they were only part of the puzzle. The map she had found showed a network of trafficking routes that extended far beyond this town, but there was one route in particular that caught her attention, one that led directly to the city where her sister Emily had last been seen. It wasn't just a lead, it was the most tangible connection to Emily she had found in years. But before she could act on it, Zoe needed to regroup, analyze the data she had collected, and find a secure way to communicate with her contacts. She couldn't risk being tracked, not when she was carrying information that could dismantle the entire operation. As she slipped into the shadows of a narrow alley, Zoe reached for the burner phone she carried, dialing a number she knew by heart. The call connected after a few rings, and a familiar voice answered, low and cautious. "Zoe, is that you?" "It's me," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "I'm in trouble, Elijah. I need a safe place to work and a secure line." Elijah Price was an old friend and a former intelligence operative who had gone underground after a botched mission years ago. He had a reputation for being paranoid, but Zoe knew that paranoia made him the safest ally she could turn to right now. There was a pause on the line before Elijah spoke again. "There's a safe house about 3 miles from your location. The address is 214 Crescent Lane. The key's under the planter by the door. Get there quickly and don't call me again unless it's an emergency." "Understood," Zoe said, ending the call and tucking the phone back into her jacket. She knew Elijah's safe house would be well stocked with everything she needed: secure servers, encrypted communications equipment, and a cache of weapons in case things went south. She set off toward Crescent Lane, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Every sound, every movement in the darkness put her on edge, but she pushed forward, her focus unshakable. When she arrived at the safe house, it was exactly as she expected, a nondescript single-story building that blended seamlessly into the quiet suburban neighborhood. She found the key under the planter as Elijah had said and slipped inside, locking the door behind her. The interior was sparse but functional, with minimal furniture and a small workspace in the corner equipped with a computer and other tech. Zoe wasted no time, booting up the system and connecting the hard drive she had stolen. The files were encrypted, but Zoe had seen this type of security before. It was sophisticated, likely military grade, but she was confident in her ability to crack it. As the decryption software ran, she scanned the photographs and maps she had taken from the warehouse, piecing together the operation's scope. The trafficking routes were marked with codes she didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a local operation. It was a sprawling network involving multiple states, and potentially even international connections. The files listed drop-off points, financial transactions, and names, lots of names. Some were victims, others were handlers, but the most chilling part was the list of buyers. These were wealthy individuals and organizations willing to pay exorbitant sums for human lives, and many of the names were tied to influential positions in politics, business, and law enforcement. As the hours passed, Zoe felt the weight of what she was uncovering. This wasn't just about Emily anymore, it was about exposing a system that thrived on exploitation and corruption. The deeper she delved into the files, the more connections she found. There were links to high-ranking officials in the town's government, including the mayor, who had publicly praised Daniels and his modern policing methods. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also painted a target on Zoe's back. If Daniels and his allies realized how much she knew, they would stop at nothing to silence her. The decryption software finally finished processing the hard drive, unlocking a treasure trove of data. Zoe's heart raced as she opened the first folder, labeled Special Operations. Inside were detailed records of the operation's most sensitive activities, including surveillance footage, financial ledgers, and personal communications. One file in particular caught her attention, a video file dated 2 years ago, the same year Emily had disappeared. With trembling hands, Zoe clicked on the file, her breath catching as the footage played. The video showed a young woman being loaded into a van by 2 men in uniforms. She was struggling, her face obscured by shadows, but the sound of her voice was unmistakable. It was Emily. Zoe's chest tightened as she watched the grainy footage, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The van's license plate was partially visible, and Zoe quickly paused the video to take a screenshot. It wasn't much, but it was a leader clue that could point her toward Emily's whereabouts. Before she could analyze the footage further, a faint noise outside the safe house snapped her out of her focus. Zoe froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun at her side. She moved silently toward the window, peering through the curtains. A figure was moving in the shadows, their movements careful and deliberate. Zoe's mind raced. Had Daniels tracked her here? Was this one of his men? She didn't wait to find out. Moving quickly, she powered down the computer and grabbed the hard drive, tucking it securely into her bag. She checked her weapon, ensuring it was loaded, and moved toward the back door. The safe house had a secondary exit, a narrow alley that led to a wooded area behind the neighborhood. Zoe slipped outside, her movements silent, and disappeared into the trees. The figure outside the safe house moved closer, their flashlight cutting through the darkness as they approached the front door. Zoe watched from a distance, her breath steady as she calculated her next move. She couldn't afford a confrontation, not now, not when she was carrying evidence that could dismantle the operation. She needed to stay ahead of her pursuers, to keep moving until she found a secure place to regroup. As she navigated through the woods, Zoe's thoughts turned to the video of Emily. The image of her sister being dragged into that van was seared into her mind, a haunting reminder of the stakes. She didn't know where the van had taken Emily, but she was determined to find out. The files she had recovered held the answers, she just needed time to piece them together. The woods eventually opened up to a quiet stretch of road, and Zoe flagged down a passing car, driven by an older man who looked at her with a mix of concern and suspicion. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Yes, please," Zoe replied, keeping her tone steady. "Just to the next town." The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Hop in." Zoe climbed into the passenger seat, her bag clutched tightly in her lap. As the car pulled onto the road, she glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see Daniels and his men emerging from the shadows. But the road behind them remained empty, and for the first time that night, Zoe allowed herself a brief moment of relief. Her reprieve was short-lived. As the car approached the next town, Zoe's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She opened it, her eyes narrowing as she read the words, "You're not as invisible as you think. We're coming." There was no sender, but the implication was clear. Daniels knew she was still out there, and he wasn't giving up. Zoe thanked the driver and got out of the car, disappearing into the town's quiet streets. She needed a new plan, a new safe place to work, and more importantly, a way to stay one step ahead of Daniels. But no matter what it took, she wouldn't stop. Emily was out there somewhere, and Zoe was closer than ever to finding her. She just needed to survive long enough to finish what she had started. The air in the small town felt heavier as Zoe Carter moved silently through the streets, her every sense heightened by the weight of what she carried. The files she had retrieved were more than just evidence. They were a direct line to the trafficking network that had operated in the shadows for years, and they had brought her closer than ever to finding her sister Emily. But every step she took felt more dangerous now. The message she'd received was proof enough. Daniels and his men were hunting her, and they wouldn't stop until she was either captured or silenced. She couldn't afford to be either. Zoe had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. She needed a secure place to work, time to analyze the files, and a way to stay ahead of Daniels and his network. But this was no longer a straightforward mission. The deeper she dove into the operation, the more she realized just how vast and organized it was. Daniels wasn't just a corrupt cop playing puppet master in a small town. He was a key figure in a system that reached far beyond its borders. And now she was a direct threat to that system. The small town she had entered after fleeing the safe house was quieter than the one she had just left. Its streets were lined with old buildings, their windows dark and their doors locked. Zoe kept her head down, moving quickly but deliberately, searching for a place to regroup. She found what she was looking for in a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. The desk clerk barely looked up as she paid in cash and took the key to a room at the far end of the building. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was private, and that was all that mattered. Zoe bolted the door and placed a chair under the handle for good measure before setting up her laptop on the worn desk in the corner. The hard drive hummed softly as she connected it, the files she had stolen glowing on the screen. Every second she spent studying them brought her closer to the truth, but it also brought an gnawing sense of urgency. Daniels wasn't the type to wait. He would be mobilizing his resources, using every tool at his disposal to find her. Zoe began piecing together the information she had collected. The routes marked on the map from the warehouse matched the ones in the files on the hard drive. They were meticulous, with timestamps and detailed instructions for moving the victims from one location to another. Each stop along the way was carefully chosen to avoid detection. Abandoned buildings, remote warehouses, and private properties owned by shell companies. The financial transactions were equally damning, linking the operation to a network of buyers and facilitators who operated with impunity. And at the center of it all was Daniels. One file stood out from the rest. It was an encrypted communication log that seemed to detail Daniels' direct involvement in the operation. Zoe worked quickly to decrypt it, her fingers flying across the keyboard as the text slowly unraveled. What she found chilled her to the bone. Daniels wasn't just a participant in the network, he was one of its architects. The messages detailed his role in coordinating shipments, silencing whistleblowers, and ensuring that the town's police force remained complicit. But it wasn't just local officials who were involved. The logs hinted at connections to state and even federal agencies, suggesting that the corruption ran far deeper than Zoe had imagined. As Zoe worked, a faint noise outside the motel room caught her attention. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun at her side. The sound came again, soft footsteps on the gravel outside. Her heart raced as she moved silently to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. A figure stood near the edge of the parking lot, partially obscured by the shadows. It was impossible to tell who it was, but Zoe didn't wait to find out. She shut down her laptop and packed her things, slipping out through the bathroom window just as the sound of a door being forced open echoed behind her. Zoe landed silently on the ground outside and crouched low, scanning her surroundings. 2 more figures were moving toward the motel room she had just left, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. She recognized the way they moved: deliberate, coordinated, like trained operatives. These weren't just hired thugs, they were professionals, likely sent by Daniels to eliminate her. Zoe slipped into the shadows, her every movement calculated as she made her way toward the edge of the property. Her mind raced as she considered her next move. She couldn't afford another close call like this. Daniels' men were too well organized, and she was running out of safe places to hide. But she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. The files she had retrieved held the key to dismantling the entire operation, and she knew that exposing it was the only way to protect herself and find Emily. She needed help, someone she could trust to process the information and get it into the right hands. Zoe thought of Elijah Price, her old ally who had provided the safe house. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that contacting him would put him in danger, but she had no other options. She found a payphone at a gas station a few blocks away and dialed his number, her eyes scanning the empty streets as she waited for him to answer. "Elijah, it's me," she said when he picked up. "I need your help." There was a pause on the line before Elijah responded. "Zoe, you're playing a dangerous game. Daniel's people are everywhere." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But I have the files. I have everything we need to take them down. I just need time to finish decrypting them." Elijah sighed heavily. "There's a secondary safe house about 20 miles from here. It's not as secure as the first one, but it'll give you some breathing room. I'll send you the coordinates." "Thank you," Zoe said, hanging up the phone and memorizing the directions he sent. She couldn't afford to waste any time. The longer she stayed in one place, the easier it would be for Daniels to track her. The drive to the safe house was tense, every car that passed her feeling like a potential threat. The countryside stretched out around her, the empty fields and darkened woods offering little comfort. When she finally arrived, the safe house was little more than a small cabin nestled in a clearing, its exterior weathered and unassuming. Zoe parked her car out of sight and approached cautiously, her gun drawn as she checked the perimeter. Satisfied that it was clear, she slipped inside and began setting up her equipment once more. The files on the hard drive were her priority, but Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels was closing in. The message she had received earlier still lingered in her mind, a reminder that he had resources she couldn't fully anticipate. She worked quickly, decrypting more of the communication logs and cross-referencing them with the financial records. The picture that emerged was both damning and overwhelming. Daniels wasn't just coordinating the operation, he was profiting from it. The payments he received were funneled through offshore accounts, making them difficult to trace, but Zoe had enough evidence to link him directly to the trafficking network. Then she found something she hadn't expected. One of the files included a manifest for an upcoming shipment, scheduled to depart from a location not far from where she was now. The manifest listed several names, including a young woman who matched Emily's description. Zoe's heart raced as she read the details. The shipment was scheduled for the next night, giving her a narrow window to act. She knew it was a trap. Daniels wouldn't let such sensitive information slip unless he wanted her to find it, but she also knew she couldn't ignore it. If there was even a chance that Emily was among the captives, she had to act. Zoe spent the rest of the night preparing, her mind focused and her resolve unshakable. She knew the risks, but she also knew that this was her best chance to strike at the heart of the operation. As dawn broke, she loaded her weapons and set out toward the location on the manifest. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but Zoe was ready. She had come too far to turn back now, and she wouldn't stop until she brought Daniels and his entire network crashing down. The night was heavy with tension as Zoe Carter crept through the dense woods surrounding the remote loading site listed in the manifest. Every step she took was calculated, her breathing controlled as she scanned her surroundings. The location was a dilapidated warehouse hidden deep in the countryside, accessible only by an unmarked dirt road. From her position in the trees, she could see the faint glow of floodlights illuminating the area, casting long shadows over the vehicles parked outside. It was clear this wasn't just another operation, this was the hub, the heart of Daniel's trafficking network. And tonight, Zoe intended to bring it to its knees. She crouched behind a thick tree trunk, pulling out her binoculars to survey the scene. Men moved purposefully between the warehouse and the vehicles, their postures alert, their weapons visible. Crates were being loaded into the back of a large, unmarked truck, and Zoe could hear muffled voices from inside the building. The faint sound of crying reached her ears, and she felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just logistics, these were human lives being treated as cargo. She gripped her handgun tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. Emotion could cloud her judgment, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. Zoe knew she couldn't take on the operation head-on. The guards were too numerous, and the odds weren't in her favor. Instead, she formulated a plan. The warehouse's generator was exposed on the east side of the building, surrounded by a flimsy chain-link fence. If she could disable it, the floodlights would go out, plunging the area into darkness and creating chaos. From there, she could move inside, retrieve the captives, and secure the evidence she needed to expose Daniels and his entire network. She moved silently through the underbrush, her every step deliberate. The generator's hum grew louder as she approached, and she could see the faint shimmer of heat rising from its vents. The fence surrounding it was padlocked, but Zoe had prepared for that. She pulled a pair of bolt cutters from her bag, quickly slicing through the chain before slipping inside. The generator's control panel was simple, an outdated model she could disable with ease. Within moments, she cut the power, and the warehouse was plunged into darkness. Shouts erupted from the guards as they scrambled to figure out what had happened. Zoe used the confusion to her advantage, moving swiftly toward the building. She slipped through a side door, her footsteps muffled by the thick rubber soles of her boots. The interior of the warehouse was even more chaotic than she had anticipated. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness as the guards shouted orders, their beams cutting through the gloom. Zoe stuck to the shadows, her movements precise as she navigated the maze of crates and machinery. As she moved deeper into the building, she found what she had feared most. A group of captives was huddled together in a makeshift holding area, their hands bound, their faces pale with fear. Among them were women and young men, their clothes torn and their eyes hollow. Zoe's heart clenched, but she didn't hesitate. She approached the group, motioning for them to stay quiet as she cut their restraints one by one. "Stay low and follow me," she whispered. "We're getting out of here." The captives nodded, their fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. Zoe led them through the darkness, avoiding the guards as she moved toward the rear exit. But just as they reached the door, a voice rang out behind her. "Stop right there." Zoe turned to see one of the guards, his flashlight trained on her, his weapon raised. She reacted instinctively, raising her gun and firing a single shot. The guard fell, his flashlight clattering to the ground as chaos erupted once again. The sound of gunfire drew the attention of the other guards, and Zoe knew she had to move quickly. She ushered the captives outside, directing them toward the tree line where they could hide. "Keep moving," she urged them. "Don't stop until you're far away from here." The captives disappeared into the woods, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. Zoe stayed behind, knowing her work wasn't done. She had one final task to end Daniel's operation once and for all. She made her way back into the warehouse, her gun drawn, her senses heightened. The guards were regrouping, their flashlights sweeping through the building as they searched for her. Zoe used the crates for cover, her movements silent as she advanced toward the central office. This was where the operation was controlled, where Daniels would be. She needed to confront him, to make him answer for what he had done, and to ensure he couldn't continue his reign of terror. When she reached the office, the door was slightly ajar, the light from a laptop screen casting an eerie glow into the hallway. Zoe pushed the door open, her gun trained on the figure inside. Daniels was seated at the desk, his expression calm despite the chaos outside. He looked up as she entered, a smirk spreading across his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Hands where I can see them," Zoe ordered, her voice steady. Daniels didn't move. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said. "You think taking down this warehouse will stop me?" Zoe's grip on her gun tightened. "This ends tonight, Daniels. No more victims. No more corruption." Daniels chuckled, his arrogance infuriating. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. This network is bigger than you can imagine. Even if you take me down, there are a dozen more like me ready to step in. I'll deal with them too," Zoe shot back. "But it starts with you." Before Daniels could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Zoe turned just in time to see two guards entering the room, their guns drawn. She ducked behind the desk as gunfire erupted, the bullets splintering the wood and shattering the laptop. She returned fire, taking down one of the guards before the other retreated. Daniels used the distraction to lunge for a weapon hundred at the desk, but Zoe was faster. She fired, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. The room fell silent except for Daniel's labored breathing. Zoe approached him cautiously, kicking the gun out of his reach. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. "You're going to answer for everything you've done." Daniels laughed weakly, blood seeping from his wound. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you're dealing with. You can't fight this system. It'll crush you." "We'll see about that," Zoe replied, pulling a pair of zip ties from her bag and securing his hands behind his back. She retrieved the shattered laptop's hard drive, knowing it might still contain valuable evidence. Then she dragged Daniels to his feet, forcing him to walk as she led him out of the warehouse. Outside, the remaining guards had fled, the chaos of the night too much for them to handle. The captives were safe, and the warehouse was empty, its operation dismantled. Zoe knew this was only the beginning. There were still others involved, and the network would try to rebuild. But tonight she had struck a decisive blow. Daniels was captured, his operation exposed, and his victims freed. It wasn't the end, but it was a start. As dawn broke, Zoe loaded Daniels into the back of a stolen van, her mind already racing with plans for what came next. She had the evidence, the captives' testimonies, and Daniels himself. It was enough to bring down the network, but she knew the fight was far from over. She glanced at Daniels in the rearview mirror, his face twisted in pain and defiance. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "No," Zoe replied, her voice resolute. "You will." And with that, she drove into the rising sun, determined to finish what she had started. The van rattled down the quiet back roads as dawn stretched its pale light across the horizon. Zoe Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she glanced at Ray Daniels in the rearview mirror. His hands were bound, his face pale and twisted with a mixture of pain and rage. Despite the shoulder wound and the zip ties digging into his wrists, his eyes glimmered with defiance, as if he still believed he had the upper hand. Zoe knew better than to underestimate him, even now. Her mind raced as she pieced together the next steps. The evidence she had collected was overwhelming: financial records, communication logs, even video footage of trafficking operations, but it wasn't enough to destroy the entire network. She needed to connect it to the larger system, to expose not just Daniels but the web of corruption he operated within. That meant getting the data to someone who could act on it without compromise. Zoe knew exactly where she had to go. The safe house Elijah had provided was a 2-hour drive from her current location, nestled deep in the woods and well off any major roads. It was their last fallback point. A secure facility equipped with encrypted communication systems and defensive measures that Elijah had spent years perfecting. Zoe had always admired his paranoia. It was the kind of trait that kept people alive. She glanced at the fuel gauge and calculated her time. She'd have just enough gas to make it if she didn't stop. No detours, no distractions. Daniels stirred in the back, shifting against his restraints. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse but laced with venom. "You think you're saving people, but you're just making yourself a target. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Save your breath," Zoe replied coldly, her eyes fixed on the road. "You're done. The only thing left for you to decide is how much you're willing to give up to save yourself." Daniels chuckled, a bitter sound that grated against her nerves. "Save myself? You don't get it, do you? I'm just a piece of this puzzle. You cut me out and they'll replace me before you even get a chance to blink. You'll never stop them." Zoe didn't respond. She wasn't about to waste energy arguing with a man who thrived on manipulation. She focused on the road ahead, letting his words fade into the background. The truth was, part of her knew he wasn't lying. The network Daniels was part of wasn't a small operation. It was a sprawling machine powered by greed, cruelty, and institutional complicity. But Zoe wasn't naive enough to think she could dismantle the entire system overnight. Her goal was to make a dent, to expose enough of its underbelly that it couldn't be ignored. If she could shine a light on even a fraction of the corruption, it would ripple outward. The safe house came into view just as the sun crested the horizon. It was a small, unassuming cabin surrounded by towering pines, its exterior blending seamlessly into the landscape. Zoe pulled the van into the clearing and killed the engine, listening for a moment to the stillness of the woods. Satisfied that they hadn't been followed, she stepped out, her gun drawn as she approached the rear doors. Daniels met her gaze with a sneer as she opened the van. "Welcome to your new home," she said dryly, pulling him out and shoving him toward the cabin. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but functional. A metal table stood in the center of the main room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. In the corner, a bank of monitors and servers hummed softly, their screens displaying various encrypted feeds. Zoe forced Daniels into a chair and secured him with additional restraints, double-checking her knots before stepping back. "You're going to sit here quietly while I do my work," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. If you so much as twitch, I won't hesitate to make sure you stay still." Daniels didn't reply, but his smirk remained. Zoe ignored him, moving to the workstation and plugging in the hard drive. The files loaded quickly, their damning contents displayed in stark detail across the monitors: financial transactions, transport routes, and personnel records, all of it meticulously organized. Zoe began transferring the data to an encrypted server, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she worked. She couldn't risk holding onto the information herself for too long. The moment Daniel's associates realized he was missing, they would mobilize to erase every trace of their operation. Time was her enemy now. As she worked, Zoe reached out to Elijah through a secure line. His voice crackled through the speakers, calm but urgent. "I was starting to think you didn't make it," he said. "Barely," Zoe replied, her focus remaining on the screen. "I've got Daniels and everything I pulled from the warehouse. I'm sending it to the drop server now." "Good," Elijah said. "I've got contacts in federal enforcement who've been itching to take a shot at something like this. They'll want to debrief you, though." Zoe hesitated. She had always worked best in the shadows, and the idea of being pulled into a federal investigation didn't sit well with her. "I'll give them what they need," she said carefully. "But I'm not sticking around for the aftermath." Elijah didn't argue. "Fair enough. Just make sure you send everything. This is our best shot at taking these bastards down." Zoe nodded, even though he couldn't see her. The data transfer was nearly complete, but her eyes kept drifting back to one file, the manifest that listed Emily's name. It was the only clue she had to her sister's whereabouts, and it wasn't something she was willing to hand over. She saved a copy of the file to a separate drive, tucking it into her bag before finishing the transfer. The room fell silent as the upload completed. Zoe leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Daniels shifted in his seat, breaking the quiet. "So what now?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You hand me over to your friends and ride off into the sunset. You really think this changes anything?" Zoe stood, her eyes cold as she approached him. "You've already lost," she said. "The people you work for. They're scrambling right now, trying to cover their tracks. They'll throw you under the bus to save themselves, and by the time I'm done, there won't be a network left to rebuild." Daniels sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Zoe leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're going to spend the rest of your life behind bars, and every day you'll know that you were the one who failed them. Enjoy that." She left him there, bound and seething, as she stepped outside to clear her head. The woods were quiet, the morning sun filtering through the trees. Zoe took a deep breath, her mind already shifting to the next phase. She had done what she could to dismantle the operation, but her fight wasn't over. The manifest with Emily's name was a thread she couldn't ignore, a path she had to follow, no matter where it led. As she climbed back into the van, she glanced once more at the cabin. Daniels was just the beginning, a piece of a larger puzzle that she was determined to solve. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but Zoe was ready. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to stop now. With the files secure and Daniels neutralized, she started the engine and drove away, the forest swallowing the cabin behind her. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the right path. She would find Emily, and she would bring the entire system to its knees. One way or another, justice would prevail.